At the beginning of 2026, the United States was very hesitant to start a war in Iran. There was a massive risk of regional escalation, and a complete regime change didn't seem plausible going by the sheer size of the regime. But there was a massive intelligence breakthrough, and that changed the Trump administration's mind, and Operation Epic Fury was launched on February 28, 2026. Hi, you're listening to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a deeper look into the US-Iran war, its origin, its impact, and where we stand today. For months before the start of the war, the US Space Force and the CIA were utilizing a sophisticated web of low Earth orbit surveillance satellites to monitor Iran. At the same time, intelligence agencies were able to hack into highly encrypted Iranian communication channels. And these communication channels included Tehran's extensive network of intersection and traffic cameras. What a massive irony! The surveillance infrastructure that Iran built to monitor its own citizens and control internal dissent was compromised and used against them. And when I say Tehran's traffic cameras were hacked into, what I mean is Israel was watching traffic movements across Tehran on a daily basis. And this helped the Israeli and US intelligence agencies to establish what they termed pattern of life analysis on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and his inner circle. So over a period of time, they were able to map out Ayatollah Khamenei's typical movement routines and security protocols. And one of the hacked traffic cameras was located on a perfect vantage point over the highly secure leadership compound near Pasture Street in Tehran. The security compound essentially was Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's official residence. It featured an extensive underground infrastructure which included a heavily fortified, blast-resistant bunker system. On February 28, 2026, the security cameras and cell phone data indicated that Iran's top-tier military commanders and advisors were gathering in the security compound in the above-ground offices. And this intelligence was confirmed by a highly placed human asset within the regime. In fact, the asset was able to verify the specific agenda and the timing of this Saturday morning meeting. And with this unique opportunity to eliminate the entire Iranian regime in one strike, the Trump administration gave the go-ahead for Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026. But how were the US and Israeli forces able to strike so quickly after obtaining this intelligence on Ayatollah Khamenei? Well, even though the Trump administration was reluctant to start a war in Iran, the preparations had been going on for months. 2 US aircraft carriers, USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Gerald R. Ford, were positioned in the Northern Arabian Sea and the Red Sea respectively. Along with these, a fleet of destroyers and Israeli fighter jets were positioned in strike range. In fact, pre-calculated flight paths and missile trajectories to Tehran were already loaded into the target computers in anticipation of this strike. So as soon as the go-ahead was received, the strike was launched to target the Pasture Street security compound of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, the Israeli and US military forces wanted to eliminate any window of escape from the security compound. So they utilized what they termed a strict time-on-target tactic, meaning the weapons were launched at staggered intervals from different locations so that the US cruise missiles and approximately 30 Israel precision-guided bombs would traverse different distances but strike the Pasteur Street compound at exactly the same second. About 200 people were killed in this strike and 700 injured. But most importantly, the core intent of the strike was accomplished. The supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and several top-tier Iranian military and security leaders were killed in the strike. Now, the primary reason the US participated in this strike was regime change. President Trump explicitly stated that the death of Ayatollah Khamenei was the single greatest chance for Iranian people to take back their country. And all of a sudden, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah of Iran, rose as a prominent alternate leader to lead a democratic transition in Iran. There was also a belief within US intelligence that even if a regime change within Iran was not achieved, at the bare minimum, the Iranians, after watching so much of destruction, would be forced into a conciliatory stance with the US and Israel. But there was one massive miscalculation. From the times of Reza Shah Pahlavi, the backbone of Iranian authoritarianism has been the security and intelligence infrastructure. Under Reza Shah Pahlavi, it was the SAVAK, the Domestic Security and Intelligence Service. And under the Ayatollahs, it has been the IRGC, or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Even though the top leadership of the IRGC was eliminated in the February 28th strike, the IRGC as an organization continued to exist. And as soon as this power vacuum was created in Iran, the IRGC took over. Essentially, Iran shifted from a single cleric theocracy to a de facto military dictatorship controlled by a tight circle of IRGC generals. Wait, but Mujtaba Khamenei is the new spiritual leader of Iran. So how can Iran be considered a military dictatorship currently? The question to be asked is, how did Mujtaba Khamenei, a mid-ranking Iran cleric, become the new spiritual leader? The answer? IRGC. The IRGC found Mujtaba Khamenei an easy candidate who could display continuity but at the same time lacked credibility and was weak, which would enable the IRGC to wield the strings of power. The Assembly of Experts, which was supposed to elect the new spiritual leader, was bullied and pressured by IRGC to vote for Mujtaba Khamenei. Any dissenting voices were sidelined, and Mujtaba Khamenei was formally elected leader on March 8, 2026. So while the battle of succession was going on in Iran, the US and Israeli forces expanded their military operation, and over 1,000 targets were hit in the first 24 hours. And once the IRGC took control in Iran, coordinated retaliatory attacks were launched, involving hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones, which targeted Israel, US military bases in the Gulf, and civilian and energy infrastructure across the neighboring Arab nations. And the neighboring US allies specifically targeted included Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait. But in early March 2026, Iran made the most impactful decision of this war. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow waterway between Iran and the UAE, connects oil and natural gas production in the Middle East to the global markets via the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. 30% of the global seaborne oil trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and 20% of the natural gas trade flows through the strait. Saudi Arabia is the largest exporter of oil through the strait, and Qatar leads in natural gas exports. A couple of IRGC commanders in the past had recommended shutting down the strait if Iran was blocked from exporting its own oil. And with the US and Israel pounding Iran, this strategy was immediately put into place. Iran started by deploying sea mines throughout the strait to make navigation entirely unviable. It utilized explosive-laden remote surface vessels to target commercial tankers and support vessels which attempted to navigate through the strait. And missile and drone infrastructure was set up in the vicinity to initiate strikes against commercial vessels attempting to transit without permission. And it demanded a service fee of $2 million per vessel to allow ships to pass through the strait. And immediately, insurance companies across the globe stripped insurance coverage for any vessel entering the Persian Gulf. And with the global oil supply choked, the United States came under intense pressure as gas prices started rising. So all of a sudden, a military conflict became an economic conflict. Now it was the turn of the United States to come to the negotiating table to discuss the terms to end the war. The US initially could not believe that it was being forced to come to the negotiating table. And it was at this time, in April of 2026, that President Trump issued the extremely alarming "a whole civilization will die" statement to force Iran to come to the negotiating table. And just a few hours before this ultimatum would have taken effect, Pakistani Field Marshal Asim Munir conducted a flurry of urgent calls to US officials, presenting a framework for ceasefire negotiations between the US and Iran. Pakistan. How did Pakistan come into the picture? Well, the "entire civilization will die" statement did raise alarm bells within Iran, and they frantically looked for someone who could initiate a line of communication with the United States. The traditional mediators in that region, Qatar and Oman, had been bombed by Iran during the course of this war. So Pakistan was the only viable ally left to initiate the negotiations. So on April 11 and 12, 2026, Pakistan hosted a 300-member US delegation led by Vice President J.D. Vance and a 70-member Iranian team led by Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. An interim ceasefire was announced by both sides while the negotiations were in progress in Islamabad. But after 21 hours of intense marathon negotiations, both sides returned empty-handed. There were three core areas of contention. The first centered around Iran's nuclear ambitions. The US demanded an affirmative commitment that Iran would permanently stop all uranium enrichment and completely dismantle its major enrichment facilities. The Iranians viewed this as an ultimatum instead of any reciprocity, so they declined this demand. The second was around the contentious Strait of Hormuz. The US wanted the status quo re-established, that is, a free passage through the Strait of Hormuz for everyone, while Iran, having experienced the impact of closing the Strait of Hormuz, asserted its sovereign right to restrict maritime traffic and levy tolls on commercial vehicles passing through the strait. And the third contentious area was the Iranian demand for an immediate end to Israeli military attacks against the Hezbollah in Lebanon. This was not acceptable to the US delegation. Wait, why does Iran care so much about the Hezbollah in Lebanon? Hezbollah serves as Iran's primary strategic deterrent against a direct Israeli attack on Iranian territory. So technically, Hezbollah is Iran's local proxy. The IRGC founded Hezbollah in the 1980s and since then has armed Hezbollah to the teeth, so Hezbollah can be the local deterrent against an Israeli attack on Iran. So Iran is very much against the US pressing it to end its geopolitical investment in Lebanon. However, during the Islamabad talks, a major incident occurred which overshadowed most of the talks. US intelligence found out that Israel was planning on assassinating the Iranian delegation while it was en route to Islamabad. This was not acceptable to the US because it could lead to the conflict getting completely out of hand. So the US tipped Iran about this. So the Iranian delegation was accompanied by Iranian fighter jets within Iranian airspace and then by Pakistani fighter planes once their plane entered the Pakistani airspace. And on April 12, once the talks had concluded, the Iranian delegation flew home again under a massive military escort of Pakistani fighter jets. But the Iranians found out that 2 Israeli fighter jets had breached Iran's western border via Iraq and were planning to intercept and attack the delegation's aircraft once the Pakistani fighter jets flew back to Pakistan. So the plane carrying the Iranian delegation executed an emergency landing in an airfield in Mashhad in northeastern Iran near the Pakistani border. From Mashhad, the delegation traveled strictly by land to avoid any further aerial targeting. But wait, isn't Israel a US ally? Yes, but there seems to be a growing rift between the two nations with respect to the Iran war. The US currently is looking to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and end Iran's nuclear program. And to achieve these, it is very important to come to the negotiating table. But Israel's primary objective is to wipe out the entire Iranian and Hezbollah leadership. And that's why it was trying to sabotage these peace talks. But as the talks fell through in Islamabad, President Trump initiated a full naval blockade of Iran on April 13, 2026. Iran's entire coastline was blockaded by the US Navy with the primary aim to restrict Iran's oil exports and combat the tolls that were being charged to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The impact was immediate. Iran nearly lost $6 billion in oil revenues during the blockade. And this ultimately forced Iran back to the negotiating table. There was another minor reason which forced Iran back to the negotiating table. Iran desperately needed to conduct the funeral of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In a very unusual reversal of Islamic tradition, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's body was kept in an embalmed and refrigerated state for months. And the primary reason for that was the massive security risk of conducting the funeral while the war was going on. So the negotiating teams from both sides met in Switzerland in mid-June 2026 to reinitiate the ceasefire talks. Subsequently, on June 17, 2026, the talks concluded with a memorandum of understanding, which was signed on the US side by President Donald Trump in Versailles, France, and on the Iranian side by President Masoud Pezeshkian in Tehran. So what are the key components of this memorandum of understanding? First and foremost, an immediate ceasefire and both nations committing to respect each other's territorial integrity. Second, on the US side, an immediate lifting of the naval blockade, and on the Iranian side, an immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And with respect to the Strait of Hormuz, the MOU recognizes Iran's geopolitical role and authorizes Tehran to hold talks with Oman and other Gulf states to define the future administration and maritime services for the Strait of Hormuz. So there is a possibility that after the talks are concluded between Iran and these Gulf states, having to pay a toll while passing through the Strait of Hormuz may become official. On the economic front, the US promised to lift sanctions against Iran and unfreeze billions of dollars in blocked Iranian assets. But most importantly, the US has pledged to collaborate with regional partners to develop a $300 billion international fund for reconstruction of the war-damaged areas in Iran. On the nuclear front, Iran explicitly reaffirmed that it will not procure, develop, or acquire nuclear weapons. But the MOU establishes a minimum protocol to deal with Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, requiring it to be downblended on-site under international supervision. The MOU set a 60-day clock to negotiate a permanent, comprehensive peace deal. So how has the ceasefire panned out so far? Well, with the funeral concluded, both sides seem to be back on the battlefield. And the primary reason seems to be the core contentious area, that is, the 400 kilograms of uranium, which Iran has enriched to 60%. 90% enrichment is required to be weapons grade, but with 60% enrichment, Iran is virtually getting there. Now, Iran has always wanted to be a regional nuclear power, and it started acquiring centrifuge technology from the late 1980s. Before the JCPOA agreement during President Obama's term was signed, Iran had attained uranium enrichment up to a 20% purity. Under the JCPOA agreement, Iran did not dismantle its capability, but agreed to severely cap it. It surrendered 97% of its enriched uranium stockpile, dismantled 2/3 of its centrifuges, and capped its enrichment purity at 3.67%, which is suitable only for civilian power generation. But it always wanted to get back to enriching uranium to weapons grade. But in May 2018, once President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran found this unique opportunity to achieve its nuclear ambitions. All it had to do was simply power back the existing advanced centrifuges, eventually reaching an enrichment level of 60%. And at this point, with the IRGC in command, there seems to be very little possibility that this will be rolled back. So the question before the rest of the world is, how long can IRGC sustain all the economic blockade before it caves in? The other possibility is that if the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is able to assert his authority and sideline the IRGC, a more pragmatic, long-term peace deal may be possible. But at this point, all we can do is wait and watch. And it is here that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. When did the US officially gain independence? The US officially gained independence on September 3, 1783, with the signing of the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain. So the answer is A, September 3, 1783. Question for the current episode. Which foreign actor or actors have been the primary enablers of Iran's 60% uranium enrichment? Is it A, Pakistan, B, Russia, C, China, or D, North Korea? Once again, which foreign actor or actors have been the primary enablers of Iran's 60% uranium enrichment? Is it A, Pakistan, B, Russia, C, China, or D, North Korea? The answer will be provided in the next episode. And it is here that we conclude today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it and will tune in again in 2 weeks for another interesting and exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.